myself the last word on this business about Nietzsche, Wittgenstein, religion. So John makes good points. They're all excellent points. But of course, nothing is ever terminal in philosophy. That's why one has to seize the last word rather than hoping that one will get it naturally. Anyway, I think John's right that Nietzsche slides between psychology and ethics and religion, but he does that knowingly. I mean, it's not that he just doesn't know about these distinctions, it's that he doesn't believe in them. And what's more, I think to point to these distinctions without realizing that they're connected to each other and that they're connected developmentally is to fall towards a kind of, analytic philosophical paradigm where you point at distinctions and you point at precisely the distinctions that are useful for the argument you want to make, without realizing that whenever you point to a distinction, you are in the same moment, in the same breath, establishing a connection. Right? You may remember this from Reason and Persuasion, that if you distinguish perching birds from wading birds, you are reminding everybody that they are both birds and that they have a common ancestor. Right? So yes, it's true that Nietzsche slides between psychology and ethics and religion. But I think the point he would make is to say, look, it's not just that he slides between them, he offers a developmental story. It's not arbitrary that religion is at the end of the developmental story, psychology is at the beginning, and morality is in the middle. That we know from the history of our own species that we didn't start with religion. We started with baboon-like creatures living in small bands, hunting and gathering on the African savannah, and they presumably have something to be a psychology, right? That there's some kind of subjective awareness and drives and motivations that are present in them as pain and pleasure and distress, longings and drives and so on. So, psychology is at the beginning of the story for a reason. Now, whether morality and religion come in that sequence or whether they have a common ancestor in, some sort of mystical sense of obligation, which subsequently discriminates itself, divides itself into ethics and religion, is something else. But the point Nietzsche would make, I think, is that you have to explain how religion comes into the world, right? And it has to develop out of something material, right? Before there were humans, there was no religion. There's a story, not a story. There's an account. There's a fact of the matter about how you get from baboon-like creatures who don't have religious experience, don't have religious culture, who don't have the category of religion, and to whom the category of religion would not apply. How you get from there to religious practice, religious people now. And it goes in that order, and it must be a material process, because if it's not a material process to get you from a religious baboon-like creatures without religion to us, then you're assuming the very thing that that you're trying to explain. If you decided that if it was some kind of spiritual process, what would that even be? How could you have a process that starts with baboon-like creatures that would be somehow spiritual? So it seems to me that Nietzsche has a comeback to this. Yes, but you're eliding distinct categories, Nietzsche's going to say, yeah, my whole story, the thing I tried to get you to understand in the second essay, is that categories develop out of each other, and that spiritual categories develop out of psychological categories, and psychological categories develop out of material categories. It has to be in that order, because the history of the human species starts with materiality. It starts with single-celled organisms, and then dog-like creatures, and then monkeys, and then baboon-like creatures, and then hominids, and then us, in that order. So of course psychology comes first, and of course there has to be an evolutionary story, developmental story, that gets you from whatever it was they were doing when they were painting caves to our religious practices now. And this raises more broadly the question of the relation between different practices and different language games. Somebody somewhere talked about the monadology of language games. So in Wittgenstein makes this point about how language games and forms of life are independent of each other, and you shouldn't judge one by the criteria of another. But this invites a criticism that what he does is he kind of fences them off from each other, and the fences he builds between them are so high that it becomes mysterious how they interact. But language games, forms of life, practices do interact. They do. There's an interplay between them, and those interplays are quite important. That our lives aren't just a disconnected a collection of different language games, different practices. We don't just fall from supporting Brentford to doing moral philosophy to cooking with completely different ways of thinking. That things like sensitivity to evidence, the avoidance of incoherence, and so on, might be arguably common across them. And we because it's us, it's always us, right? There's the unity of our own consciousness, so we can look across from one language game that we participate in to another. So Wittgenstein arguably isolates language games from each other. He also has little or nothing to say about how they develop. But if the whole Nietzschean thing is about development. You'll have gathered by now that to understand something for Nietzsche is to do its genealogy. Well, reaching for Wittgenstein, one of the effects of reaching for Wittgenstein is to just set your face against historical, genealogical, developmental accounts of the concepts that we're interested in philosophically, because Wittgenstein doesn't have historical sense. Wittgenstein doesn't have anything to say about how practices, how languages, language games, how concepts develop. He just talks about them as if they're just there. He also doesn't say anything about power relations between them, and that's rather important. So one of the things that's disingenuous, I think, about Christians appealing to Wittgenstein on language games is that religion, and Christianity in particular, doesn't simply assert its rights as a practice amongst others. It doesn't just say we're a bit like Brentford fans. People singing hymns in church is a bit like Brentford fans singing apparently implausible claims about the greatness of their team as a way of celebrating victory. There's an additional claim that this is the most important discourse. This is the most important practice, that religious practice, is of infinite importance for not just for the individual who practices it, but also for those of us who don't. That if you're not going along with the Brentford faithful, well, okay, they're going to say that you're missing out on a great experience, but you're not putting your soul in danger. You're not running the risk of having a meaningless life. But that is what Christians... So Christians don't just say that their religious practices are one religious practice, or one practice, one form of life, one language came amongst many and should be respected for its specificity. As Nietzsche points out in the third critique, the claim is something else. It's that you've got to be doing this, otherwise, otherwise you are in anguish and despair. And if you don't realise you're in anguish and despair, it's because you're also in denial. Now, that's a very strong claim. That sounds a bit like the kind of non-refutable evidence in different, strictly speaking, in Popperian terms, meaningless attribution of motivation that we accuse Nietzsche of in the first part of this talk. So we reach a standoff, which is exactly where philosophy normally leaves us.
What are we going to do now? 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 Yes, what are we going to do now?